a party or a barbecue or, you know.
No, we are now live, I hope.
Acceptable.
For some reason it hasn't connected to the event, but that's okay.
Says it's live streaming.
We're live streaming. Excellent. Good afternoon, Frankston, Frankston City, Frankston South, Frankston North, Langwarrin, langwarrinsouth, Skye, Sandhurst, Seaford, all the wonderful places that make up our wonderful city. Apologies for the very slight delay in starting. We did have a technical issue where Microsoft Edge decided to update. I'm going to revert back to Firefox from now on. It just seems to be a little bit more stable. So if you're thinking about which browser to use, I definitely think Firefox is the one to change to go for. Today we are talking public safety and emergency management and the role of local council in that area. I'm pleased to be joined again today with Sue Baker, running the Northwest Ward, Justin Turner, also running the Northwest Ward, Brad Hill, running the South Ward, and Peter Malone, who's showing us how smart he is by displaying all his books today. Thank you, Peter. Also running on the South Ward. The image I have behind me today is an image taken from the staging area of a fire that took place in 2018 that I attended, which was in the Pines Flora and Fauna Reserve, where fortunately we were able to pull it up. But I thought it was quite a relevant photo for today because we're talking about what the role of council is in emergency management and public safety. It's not a topic that an awful lot of people know much about. Brad, I imagine that you'll have been involved in some of this in your previous work in council. But under the Emergency Management Act, councils have a specific responsibility, in particular around coordination, but also in terms of community messaging for disaster preparedness, but also in terms of relief and recovery arrangements as well. As an example, recently when the social housing towers were locked down in the northern part of Melbourne, the local council actually had a responsibility there to provide relief for the many thousands of residents who are in those towers. So it's not just about fires and floods and everything else. There's a whole range of different risks across the city. It's important that the councillors that you vote for understand what their responsibilities are, but also understand what some of those risks are as well. I might throw to you first, Justin, to open up your perspective on this and how you see it from where you sit, and perhaps if you can reflect a little bit on some of the key risks that you see, or some of the key public safety issues you see within the Northwest Ward. There's obviously those things that council has a direct responsibility for, but there's also the things that council can advocate for, particularly when it comes to things like policing and so on.
Yeah, thanks, David. Look, it's certainly not a subject that I have a lot of experience with, but in terms of, particularly the Northwest Ward, look, I think there needs to be a little bit more planning involved, and the word planning is used very loosely. In terms of risk mitigation, because Frankston predominantly comes up under a high flood zone and under a bushfire risk management area. And I think that's fairly indicative of what's happened in the last few years in the Flora and Fauna Reserve. And that's sort of notwithstanding the fire at the, I've forgotten what it's called now, the old Ansell factory there on Frankston Dandenong Road that jumped across into Frankston North from Seaford. Look, the fire crew absolutely did a stellar job there, but in terms of what could have happened, it certainly could have been disastrous. We certainly got the notice from Emergency Victoria that it was time to go. Mm-hmm. And look, having two young children, it was one of those things where you just don't muck around with it. You got the message, it's time to leave. From growing up on a farm, look, it's sort of a very, very different story. On a farm, it's sort of stay and fight, but in suburbia, it's not necessarily the right thing to do. In terms of what I sort of see the council's role is, and I'd love anyone to jump in to tell me if I'm wrong or not, but it's about managing how we're prepared, sort of having those contingencies in place. And I'm not I'm not advocating for sort of, worst case scenarios and we start talking about, like attacks and riots and things like that. I think, part of those should form, perhaps a side note to it, but the things that affect us on a summer and winter basis, like your fires and your floods, is absolutely something that I think if we don't have in place already, we should probably put the limelight onto there. In terms of, how and where we activate sites for shelter and provisions, council's role as being a, sort of a spokesperson in terms of an informational support structure to make sure that there's no sort of overstepping between the professionals that are there and the site. I don't want to say supervisors, but I'll use that word if you understand what I'm saying. And in terms of provisions, I already said the shelters have a contingency funding in place, your food and supplies, and it's just about readiness at the end of the day. There are things we can do in terms of, I suppose, mitigation, which is, limiting the sort of source that we have or fuel that we have for our fire risks, making sure their infrastructure and our overflow basins are sort of relevant and up to standard for what we need, not just today, but sort of what we're going to need over the next little bit as the city sort of changes. And sort of along the post-event side of things is how council can work with both the community and the SES for the clean-up side. But one thing that jumps to mind, and I'd love to hear some sort of feedback, is I can recall, now I don't know if it was last year or the year before, there was a place in Langwarrin that was a rural conservation zone 2.
Mm-hmm.
And a small component of this larger allotment had that conservation overlay there. And the landowner was told that they obviously need to go out and thin out the bushland, but they were told by council that they can't remove the bushland because it's conserved. But then they're being told by the CFA that they must do it. So they applied to the CFA for a burn off, which they were told they're not allowed to burn off. So we've got a landowner here, for this example, that has the bushland, isn't allowed to thin it out by council, isn't allowed to burn it off, by direction of the CFA, and they ended up with a fine. So I think there needs to be some emphasis on not just relevance, but common sense with some of this as well.
Yeah, I mean, that strikes me as a case where there's kind of two conflicting opinions that are coming in, and you would hope that you would have a council that would encourage the council staff to actually look at that on a kind of, how do you deconflict that particular situation? We also know that, particularly, if you look at places like Langwarrin, like Skye, those kind of urban-rural interface zones that we have within Frankston City, we're going to keep running into that issue on a pretty regular basis. And on the one hand, we also know that the natural environment does benefit from cool burns, in terms of regeneration and clearing out the waste and so on. But at the same time, we need to make sure that property owners that live within that urban-rural boundary, or that urban-rural interface, are actually able to manage the risks appropriately. And I would certainly hope that they challenge that particular fine and we're able to get that resolved appropriately. But I think we've learned hard lessons from 2009. We've learned some really hard lessons in 97. In 2018, we were in the Pines Flora and Fauna Reserve again. We know that within Victoria and within Melbourne in particular, that the whole of the outer metropolitan area is the interface between the bush and the urban environment. And we've seen before that even in places like Canberra, back in, I think, the early 2000s, and it was, they had major fires that burnt many streets in that you wouldn't expect to burn. And I think there's got to be a bit of common sense and logic applied to how we actually look at these, but being very conscious of the environmental values that sit with that as well.
Can I ask you a question, Stephen? Is that okay?
Yes, of course.
So, to your knowledge, has there been any sort of fire mitigation, particularly in the Pines Flora and Fauna Reserve? Because as somebody that lives here, I haven't seen or noticed it like I did in perhaps the previous 6 or 8 years. There generally used to be several days of clean up and burn offs and whatnot, but it's something that I've noticed that hasn't, well, either I haven't noticed it or it hasn't been happening. Is that anything you're across?
Oh, look, so it all depends a little bit on who the landowner is. So some land is owned by the council, some land is owned by Parks Victoria, and obviously some of it is private. The burn that went through in 2018 was quite extensive anyway, and so it could be that they've looked at that and said, well, actually, there's not a necessity to burn that away. Again, there's also a lot of the bushland there is actually sort of regenerating and recovering as well. But there's also there are things that council can do in its own reserves around looking for non-native invasive species to get to rip them out, or to look around thinning out some of the ground cover and so on. It's always a real challenge though to do a burn in an urban area as well. Because people that live close to it are going to complain about this. The smoke is hazardous, it does have an impact on people's health. And so you need to be really careful about it, but certainly it's something that I would hope is has regular updates through to council about, in terms of how that mitigation work is proceeding. And now is the time to be doing it, whether you're a private landowner or whether you're a council, is to make sure that you're doing your clear up now. I did a short video on that a couple of weeks ago when I was cleaning my gutters. Even if you're in the urban area, get your gutters cleared out as well. That's all part of being prepared, and part of being a more resilient community as well. So I hope that answers your question, Justin.
Yeah, it does. Thanks. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Sue, you live a bit closer to the beach.
Yes, I do. And yeah, so the issues that Justin's raised are, as being issues for Frankston are very much part of what I've been thinking about. But what I wanted to raise actually, in starting to talk about this, was the Municipal Emergency Management Plan. It was really great to be able to go to the council website and pull up the document that does set out a framework for who has what responsibility, how the council does link into a whole range of different organisations, be it the SES, Red Cross, the police, state government, and a whole range of other bodies. So their role as coordinators in the event of an emergency, whatever it is vital. And that to me speaks to having really great communication links and good relationships with the current office holders who would be responsible, and that changes over time. I mean, the council staff will have officers who will be responsible, so keeping abreast of who needs to know what currently and keeping that current is important. I was also interested to read about the pandemic plan that is part of the municipal emergency plan, and really interesting just to scan through it in terms of how that plan has played out and been used to support what council has been doing over this year. Also very important to keep that up to date. So with a new council coming in and still living with COVID-19 and still working through the issues that we have as a community, that's going to be very important to keep on top of that, liaising with all the relevant bodies around roles and responsibilities. The other thing I noticed, which I thought was really interesting, was in the sort of a summarising statement or an executive summary at the start of that document. It does talk about everyone having a responsibility for emergency management planning. So this notion that my government or my council or my somebody else will be responsible, that's great that people in positions of authority and responsibility have a plan, but Sue, I need to take responsibility for keeping my world safe. And that's what struck me about council's responsibility, that really they have a responsibility to help people with overarching plans, but also keep communications live and current and fresh so people can clean their gutters or make provisions to do things safely around the community. And then that got me thinking about some of the environments that I've worked in over my career, where emergency planning and certainly avoiding emergencies is critical. And for instance, airlines, I've worked with airlines, several of them over the years, and working with a workplace that is at 36,000 feet a lot of the time, you know, emergency planning for issues that can happen there, really important. And I actually looked back out of interest at smoking, because some of you may remember that smoking used to be allowed on flights. And I was thinking, goodness me, you know, we certainly have to keep evolving and continuously improving our views and approaches to mitigating disasters and emergencies that can happen. And I was reminded of a smouldering seat I once saw on a 747. So that was just before the 1990 cutoff for no smoking now. So yes, emergency planning, I think, is an ongoing conversation. It's important to reassure people that there is work and conversation current and active, and people who have the roles and responsibilities to take care of the community. And my most recent role working in the disability sector, risk assessing was part of everyone's responsibility and was incorporated in all the training that we all had, so that we managed our workplaces, our group homes, going out to different activities. Everyone was aware of supporting people and ensuring everyone was safe all the time, and just planning to avoid any minor crisis, let alone the organisation having more broad emergency planning policies. So those are just some of my reflections on the topic.
I'm really glad that you touched on the aspects around disability there as well, because one of the things that the council needs to be doing is looking at what are the different vulnerabilities that exist within our community and making sure that they're catering for them. So whether that be children, whether that be older residents, whether that be residents with a disability, and so on. And I've, in my own experience, both in terms of disaster management, both in Australia and abroad, is that very often governments and local governments in particular don't automatically think of those different groups as having particular needs. So, you know, a child is not a small adult. Somebody with a disability isn't just somebody who has trouble walking or moving or engaging in conversation. There's a whole range of interlayers there around risk factors when it comes to emergency management. Peter, I might pass to you, because you've, you know, part of your experience in defence would have probably given you a slightly different perspective on this as well. And I'll give Brad the opportunity to sort of go next, to then sort of reflect on the discussion we're all having, but also how that relates to his own time when he was in council 8 years ago.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. There's so many points I could start off from there, but Sue mentioned airlines and aircraft. I was the formation ground safety officer out at RAF Williams, based at Laverton. And as such, I had to take charge of emergency response at an airbase. That was interesting. There were a few issues that occurred, and I had to coordinate the emergency response. So that was interesting, from fuel spillage on the runway to a fire in an engine as an aircraft was about to take off, and then had to stop, of course, and the emergency response team had to swing into action. And there's scenarios surrounding all those things that you have to have in your mind and be ready for, because, I mean, it may have taken off. We had to have all these things ready to go. So that forward planning issue that people have talked about is really important. So they were interesting times. Down at Chisholm Institute, of course, we talk about emergency response. We talk about emergency response if somebody comes, one or a group of people come into the campuses, etc., and we have to have our emergency response ready to go. And of course, as a health and safety rep, I'm very involved in committees that talk about that. Going from that to perhaps talking about fire, just in our local urban environment, in our reserves, etc. It's interesting you talk about There's a little bit of a this way and that, isn't there, between wanting to manage the environment and wanting to have as natural an environment as we can, and what is a natural environment anyway. Yeah, very complex. So, I mean, I'd bring to bear on those sorts of discussions how the natural environment can be managed. It can be, you know, from a biological point of view, which would, in a way, cool burns, you mentioned cool burns, small sections of thing, leaving time for any creatures to get out of the way, can all be done. And it doesn't degrade the natural environment. In fact, it was a fire regime. You get things in Australia now like different types of grasses growing up trees. The Aboriginals would never have allowed that to happen. They had their burns and their cool burns going on. So it is the case. The problem is you get in councils and other places, people, you get this conflict between authorities, and that was a case in point you mentioned. Gosh, legally they should have been able to get out of that pretty easily, what I thought. But it's difficult when they're in that position. They've got two authorities advising in different ways. It'd be good to have on council expertise in these sorts of issues so that it is sensible. And Justin mentioned it, you know, we've got to be sensible about this. We do. We have changed the environment. We always, human beings do. We change, it becomes an urban environment. And then we have that interface, and the interface has to be managed in an environmentally sensitive way as possible, but it can be done. So the other aspect I'd like to bring into it is the concept of actually understanding what other people have to do. It's clear, you know, I've got it on the screen over there, and I did look at it earlier, the guidelines, you know, for mayors and councillors and what you're supposed to do. This is reasonably straightforward stuff. Should always be revised. We've got to have contingencies for emerging threats, of course, but actually having an understanding what other people have to do, I think, is a really good thing, because then you've got empathy and you know, some knowledge of what they're going through. So all important stuff. What you need is councillors on there who are capable to grasp all this and make sure it works in the right way. Just say the multiplicity of, the only other thing I'd say is the multiplicity of risks in our urban environment. There's huge, you know, large vehicle accidents, storm, you know, power lines going over, et cetera, et cetera. There's a multiplicity of risks. So we've got to bear in mind that we have to actually also ask the questions, like a board, you know, the council, ask the questions. Don't interfere at the minute and the minutiae, of course. That's not a board's role, but ask the questions to make sure that council is prepared and we do have the people we need to take care of things if needed.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And most importantly is councillors understanding that, you know, the last thing that what we call the control agencies want is politicians down their neck, telling them what to do. Yeah,
it doesn't work. Doesn't work.
Brad, would you like to share your reflections from when you were involved in council as well?
Yeah, certainly. I guess what we're all very lucky for when I was on the council is that we didn't have any major emergencies crop up, and I think that's you know, we ought to be thankful for that. We live in a country that is subject to fire risk, extreme risk, and there are areas of the municipality that are particularly at risk. But look, I might just split up what I have to say into two halves. Firstly, as a councillor, what's expected of you and what's expected of the council, and then secondly, you know, from the resident people perspective. Sue mentioned the emergency management plan the council is required to have. The council has staff who are specialised in this area, and they also, when they write that plan, they engage with the stakeholders in the emergency services in the government and whatnot. So as as there's a requirement for that to be reviewed periodically, what will happen as a councillor, this will come up on the agenda for a meeting. It's there for you to look at, and the council votes to approve the document, and then it becomes a live document. So that's something that as a councillor you have a role there to play. The only arm of the emergency services that the council really has a whole lot to do with, I would suggest, is the SES. The council provides the SES with rooms, with equipment, with a venue. They also have other funding sources, but again, as a councillor, you know, I would put it to you that you have responsibility to make sure that their equipment is up to date, that it's funded, and I would urge you, if you're elected or even if you aren't elected, to go down there and have a visit and have a chat to them. It's important that they are ready to move. They're all volunteers, and they deserve to be equipped, you know, in order to maximise the preparedness. The other council function, as far as emergencies are concerned, which hasn't come up, you might notice every time there's a localised emergency, a fire or a flood or whatever it is, all of the various arms of the emergency services and the volunteers, where do they come? They converge on a local community hall, right? They come to a council-owned community house or a facility like that. So we need to make sure that our community halls are up to a certain standard, that at a moment's notice, you know, there's the space, there's the facilities, there's a kitchen, there's, you know, everything that's required to service the people who need to do the actual work. And it's we do have a lot of them around the Frankston municipality, and I'd urge you to visit them, particularly in your ward, and make sure they're right. Another emergency that we had in South Ward years ago, I don't know if you remember, it might nearly be 20 years ago now, fire in the reserve, the reservoir. You remember that?
Yep.
Yeah, I was living in Mornington at the time, and we sent crews up for that one, and it was a very busy summer, as I recall.
It was indeed. Right. So you know, just because, you know, you might live in Frankston South, you might, you know, you aren't immune. It isn't all about the outlying areas in the interface. No. Then there's the you know, the expectations of the people, and we have some conflicts, or at least I won't say conflicts, but overlapping areas of concern. Let's put it that way. You know, we need to protect property. We need to reduce risk, because you know, at the end of the day, it's also about people's lives. It's, you know, it isn't only losing your house. You know, people can actually die, and we need to do everything we can to minimise that risk, and that includes burn off. I'm also cognizant of the fact that in Frankston we are losing our tree cover. You know, that's in decline. It isn't on the increase. So the only reason I mention that is that we do need to be smart about it. We do need to, I think, conduct that risk mitigation, the burn-offs, in a sensible, well thought out way. Yeah, we don't just want to chop everything down, because at the end of the day, we have to live here. You know, my kids live here. They're going to continue to live here after I'm gone. I want this to be a beautiful town. We need to actually have, you know, an evidence-based approach, you know, that actually makes sense. And I'm not suggesting we do, but, you know, our tree cover is also very important. Yeah.
The other aspect of the tree cover issue there as well is that, and the Red Cross actually did a really interesting paper on this. Well, I think it's interesting because it's my field of work, but the Red Cross did a really interesting paper last year or the year before around the impact of heat on health. And we know that climate's getting hotter. We can still debate whether that's human induced or not. I know what my view is, that it's human induced.
Anymore.
Some people choose to debate that.
Yeah, but does it matter? I mean, it's happening anyway. I mean,
it's happening anyway.
Yeah.
But the other issue with tree cover is that it creates urban heat islands, which then has an adverse effect and impact on human health. And council has to include within, for example, its emergency management plan, how we deal with the issue of heat. We know that, for example, around Carrum Downs, that is a particular hotspot in terms of the urban heat effect that takes place. So it's more than just fire risks and things like that. Peter.
Yeah, sorry, I just want to throw something in there. There's, as I said, I love the natural environment. We have an urban environment, and as you say, tree cover is important. There's species of trees you can select, which will basically not support fire nearly as well as other species of trees, and reduce the heat much more markedly. So once again, it's really a matter of working with the experts and doing this. So I agree with what you guys are saying, and as you and Brad were saying, it's very important, but there's ways of doing it without really increasing the fire risk. So yeah,
we have to be smart about it. Exactly right.
Absolutely.
You know, and we as councillors, we need to take the advice of those around us with the expertise. The council does have some very well qualified and experienced staff. Occasionally it's from external consultants. It's really important that as a councillor, you know, that you recognise that, you know, having the title and the role of a councillor, it doesn't necessarily make you an expert on anything. And that can happen. I've seen that in the council chamber. So yeah, there's the advice, the expertise is all available to you as a councillor. You need to listen to it. You need to weigh it up.
I think one of the other things that's really important about the role of councillor is being able to hold a number of different issues in your head at one time. So we're talking about emergency planning today, but actually we're talking a little bit about climate, but we're also talking a little bit about environment. And all these issues do cross over, and it would be very easy to have a pet project or a pet issue and invest all your energy into that, which then blindsides you or makes you blind rather to other issues which do have an impact. So I think that is an important skill for a councillor to have, that ability just to keep several balls in the air at one time as you have debate, as you have evidence from the council staff or experts or people who really understand things. And then in connection with the agreed council plan, you know, what is our line of sight through to the next 4, 10, 20 years, what's the best decision given all of those factors that's going to enable us to take a step forward rather than going off down a rabbit hole on a very short-term view or issue on something. So that's, and with something like emergency planning, it could be we do and dust it, we talk about it, but actually the ramifications of having a good plan and how they speak to other issues, I think, are really important for councillors to be open-minded on.
It's about being able to make those lateral connections between different issues, isn't it? Rather than just thinking, oh, well, if I do this, that'll be great for the community, but not understanding necessarily the follow-on consequences of that decision that you make as well. And it's about understanding what they are without necessarily being an expert in any of them as well. Justin? Sorry, Peter.
Oh, sorry, interconnectedness and interoperability between. Sorry, Justin.
No, don't be sorry. No, look, I think everybody's touched on a really good point, and I think Brad started off with pointing out that we've got those resources in place, so making the use of their expertise, that's number one. But in saying that, obviously we rely on their expertise, and coming back to what Sue said, to form the bigger picture. So A leads to B leads to C, the continuity as a part of this overall plan. And I know this keeps coming up talking about an overall plan, but I think it's all relevant even when we break it down to the smaller sections from emergency management right through, it needs to be conducive of a larger picture as well.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I do also wonder though if there's more proactive work that council can do as well. So, for example, linking in more with the private sector in Frankston, both in terms of supportive response or relief and recovery, but also to help even your small businesses and through to your larger businesses have a better appreciation of business continuity planning. Because that links to people's livelihoods. And if people, as we're already seeing through COVID-19, there are a lot of people losing their livelihoods. The more we can do to help other organisations to mitigate, or at least understand how to mitigate those is really important. And again, I think shows the link back to how we operate overall as well. The other thing I think is really important in terms of the role of councillors and in particular the role of the mayor. And I kind of think through the experience that I've had in different places and different countries. And I was in Japan in 2011 for the earthquake and tsunami there. And the thing that I really noticed was that the communities that responded better in the relief and recovery phase were the ones that had really good, effective local leadership. And I think that that's really critical. And it's not just about the mayor or the councillors providing that leadership, but it's actually around growing, supporting that leadership throughout the community and then bringing it together in a practical way from time to time as well. So perhaps a few reflections on that thought before we kind of move on to the broader public safety question.
Yeah, I think leadership is really critical on any topic that the council is responsible for, and so being very visible, role modelling or holding conversations or demonstrating how stakeholders need to be engaged is really crucial to any good governance. And actually, as you were talking earlier, everyone, I was thinking about, setting the bar really high for Frankston. So if we do, or if the council has the opportunity to reset and recalibrate relationships with businesses, individuals, community groups, relationships with state government, adjoining council areas, then, there's this concept, if you reach for the stars, then, if you fall short of that, you're still reaching pretty high. Whereas if our bar is just to tick off lots of little quick wins, well, then we're never going to quite get higher than that in terms of the size and the audacity and the, the really big goals that actually help everybody take a step up and do some bigger things. So I think leadership is important, and by demonstrating great leadership, I think you then, as you were saying, Stephen, you encourage everybody in whatever role they're in the community to lead their bit even better than they're doing already. So, I chatted to some young people this week about what they're doing with peer groups that they're setting up to support mental health. That is just awesome that young people are doing that, and they need to feel and be supported that that's a really great, courageous thing to do, and have role models that they can look up to say, yeah, we are doing this because look at what council's doing, or look at what these other businesses are doing. We're all championing some really great outcomes and some great behaviours here.
Yeah, and I think often young people are not necessarily viewed within community as having as big a role within the kind of public safety emergency management space, when in fact, certainly from my sort of 15 years of experience of working in communities, it is in fact the opposite, is that young people actually have a huge amount to offer. They often have a lot more energy than others. And I think it's, I actually think it was quite disappointing that the last council actually abolished the Youth Mayor program. And I'd love to see that reintroduced as well, and to really look at how we properly engage with young people so that they can help make Frankston a much more resilient place going forward.
I might just talk about leadership a bit and the ability to lead and who are leaders. There's a term that's sort of bubbled up. Terms do bubble up, and a lot of the time they come from the US or somewhere else, and suddenly they're in vogue. I noticed the term people leader has bubbled up, and I'm not against it per se at all, but the way it's used sometimes in organisations is if somebody's designated a manager, they're therefore a people leader. Well, maybe not. And if you look up the definition on Google, the people leader on the internet, a people leader can be somebody in management for sure, but it might be a colleague. It could be people on the same level who aren't actually managers at all. So, but they are respected and they are a leader because they show great example. And sometimes some of these people are young people, and across different organisations, I've seen young people take up challenges in emergencies, with absolute, vigour and energy. And it's hats off to them. Hats off to them. They hop in. I was at an accident, at the site of an car accident some years ago, McClellan Drive and Cranbourne Road. Yeah, might have been, I think it was, no, not McClellan, the next one down in Langwarrin. Can't think of its name now, but it's parallel to McClellan Drive. And
Warrandyte.
Thank you.
Warrandyte Road, yeah.
Warrandyte Road. And it basically, I've been in the military. I jumped. It was a mother and a child, and they ran off the road into a garage, and I instinctively jumped out of my car, and I'll base that on training, not bravery, and ran over there. And the only other two people who did that instantly were two young people. These guys were in a ute. They're about 18 or 19. I think the tradies had a business. Bang, they're over there. Everybody else froze. And we went over there and got the child out of the car, and the mother was in shock, so we helped her out. About 5 minutes later, the police arrived, but the young guys jumped out. They were into action, and they didn't freeze. So I mean, we've got hats off to the young people. They do have a lot of energy, and they will help. They won't hang back. So.
Yeah. But before we move on to the wider sort of public safety space a little bit, and some of the other roles that council play in that regard, whether it be around animal management or sort of preventative programs for reducing graffiti or road or traffic management, those kinds of things. It's probably worth also flagging that there are some practical things that I've seen in other municipalities where, for example, the council staff are actively encouraged to get involved in voluntary emergency services organisations, whether that be the fire or the SES or the Red Cross and so on. I'm not sensing a real kind of engagement in that regard from the current council, and certainly it's one of the things I'd love to see more of, because the more people we have engaged in those activities, whether it be Red Cross or SES or fire services, the more resilient again we are in the community, because it means that more of our neighbours are involved, which means if something local happens, there's somebody there who's more likely to be able to respond and assist. I know that through my first aid qualifications, for example. It's suspended at the moment because of the pandemic. But I'm on I'm trying to remember what the name of it is, but it's an app that alerts you if there's a local cardiac arrest, and you can go and provide assistance, and that's all done through Ambulance Victoria as well. So there are lots of small things that people can do that make us more resilient as a community. But the other thing that strikes me as well is that unless we actively promote and engage both preparedness and involvement within Frankston, we'll never really be a truly resilient city. And if you think about some of the responses to COVID-19, yes, council signed off on a range of financial initiatives. I'm not going to comment on those. I think more could be done, but at the same time, they also, they stood down a whole bunch of staff who could have been redeployed to help support older or vulnerable residents as well in a COVID safe way, to check in on people, to provide information, to help those who couldn't access supermarkets, those kinds of things. And I would hope that on a new council coming in, they'd be looking a little bit more laterally at how we can use council resources to support people at times of crisis. Any reflections on that before we move on to the wider public safety issues?
Well, just 5 seconds. 5 seconds, because I know I've had a fair go. Sorry, Sue. No, look, just what you just said. Chisholm Institute did that with teachers. Okay, they could have been just laid off or whatever. They were brought in as assistant teachers to manage the COVID situation, and it worked really well. So, yeah, case in point.
No, all I was going to say in terms of participation, I suppose the best word is, look, I know throughout my career in various sectors, is the private sector for the most part actually embraces it. Whether or not it's allowing a day a month or a day a week or however they sort of see the value in it, with paying their staff to volunteer with your SES, with your CBO, your community-based organisations or fireys or whatever that may be, and I think it all comes back to the big word participation, and that's something that I think we should be pushing, and that sort of ties in with, and I'm backtracking a little bit with what Sue and Peter were talking about with youth participation. What you mentioned as well with the youth governance or youth council being disbanded. Look, I won't go into detail now because it's not the forum for it, but look, I'd like to bring forward a youth participation model which would fill the gap into sort of branching out into the mental health space, into the volunteering space, into the preparedness space in an overall participation model, not a youth governance, just to be very clear, a youth participation model.
Yeah, and we can perhaps pick that up on Tuesday when we've got Gerard Philippe joining us, who's the former youth mayor, and we'll be talking specifically around youth policy as well. But I think that's a point well made, and again points to the lateral connections between the topic we're talking about today and everything else that happens at council as well. Sue?
Yeah, no, well, in terms of participation, agree with Justin. The corporates I've worked with recently are increasingly having more people get involved or giving the space or the time. It's not just money that corporations are offering, it's actually people who want to go and get involved. And I think very often their experience is that they learn an awful lot about the organisation or the sector that they go and participate in, which in turn helps that organisation. And there's this sort of circular double loop learning development for everybody. And that's certainly been my experience, as a parent. I got involved with fostering many years ago, thinking, oh, I'm a parent, I've got lots to offer. I know I can help some young people. I tell you what, I think I learned far more in terms of, the sort of circumstances and situation, a whole range of issues that my very narrow little family learning had to offer, which was fabulous. And that has been my experience with fundraising for different organisations or sitting as a governor on school council. So I think, the more participation you can encourage, there's massive learning and builds the resilience and helps the community help itself. So I think that's great. I actually looked at the SES site this morning as well.
Oh, did you?
Just out of interest. and thought, oh, I could do that.
Will we be seeing him in orange overalls anytime?
I think I'd look great in orange, actually. Orange is the new black, isn't that the phrase? I don't know.
We do have a comment here from Trudy Poole, who runs a homeless brekkie club in Frankston, which does include 80 volunteers from many of the teams that come across areas within Frankston City Council, Chisholm, St John of God, and small businesses around Frankston. I think that's a really good example of the kinds of things that, as council, we should be supporting, because it's not just about getting on trucks or providing relief support during a major crisis, but it's also about the day-to-day volunteering as well that makes us much more resilient as a community. I should also point out I've neglected to say hello to the candidate for the West Ward, Oliver Hill, as well. I'm sure Oliver's quite across these issues too, particularly given the seaside risks that he's probably living with on a daily basis. Brad, did you want to add any other reflections before we kind of move on to the wider public safety issues?
No, I think we've done emergency to death, to be honest. So yeah.
Okay, all right, great. Thank you.
Right, before we move on, can I ask Brad a question?
Sure.
Was there any like sort of preparedness and drills or anything like that in your time in council for the emergency management sort of side of things? And I know I'm probably testing memory and stuff like that. It's something that occurred to me.
Not that I recall. Certainly the plans were kept up to date. Yeah, I can't definitively answer that.
No worries. Easy.
Well, we might have to change that if we get a new council, Brad, because those things should be tested at least annually, one would hope. So on the broader public safety issue, and I've had a couple of residents from, a nice picture of the Coast Guard there. That's their new boat, I think.
That's from Oliver Hill.
So that's from Oliver Hill. Okay.
It can happen out there at sea too.
Yeah, good. I've had a number of residents contact me about things like, for example, road safety, or some of the particular, not necessarily the major through roads that we have, like the Nepean Highway or Frankston Flinders Road and so on, but some of the other roads like Heather Hill Road or Golf Links Road and so on, where they're quite concerned around kind of the repeated safety issues where it comes down to how vehicles move through those areas, the risks associated with that. And there is still a role for council within that in terms of, either having traffic calming measures in place or consulting with residents around what those might look like and so on. So I think it's important that people understand that the public safety component is much broader than just the things that we see every summer or every winter. But there's a whole range of other things. I also know that council was involved in investing in CCTV for particular areas as well. What are the other kind of broader issues that you think are important for the wards in which we're seeking election?
I'd like to start, if I may.
Yes, of course.
So when it comes to safety, it isn't only about actual safety, it's also perception of safety, right? Mm-hmm. People need to feel safe as they're walking down the street. Mm. What makes people feel safe is having others around them, having other people in the area. It's not deserted or dark or anything like that, but if it's an active, lively environment, people will generally feel more safe, right? So yes, CCTV is something that the council is able to roll out, and I noticed the CCTV network has been progressively expanded, which is a good thing. But if you can attract people to an area, right, if you can improve the amenity of an area, then that also increases the level of safety, right? So we have areas of Frankston in that category, like the work that's happened on Wells Street outside of Hoyts. It's been revitalised. We've got lighting. We've got street furniture. We've got a little bit of artwork, if you like. And there's other areas of Frankston that if we were able to reinvigorate, and I know people have been talking about Nepean Highway, but there's others as other candidates as well. Then you're creating a safe space. Yeah. Right. And that's I think what's something the council's able to do.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, because the things that draw us together do create environments where people are obviously in a COVID safe way. Let me just flag that. But the things that bring us together are the things that give us greatest comfort, and they act as a way of mitigating poor behaviour by others as well.
Well, yes. Can I just mention something? I just want to see what other people think about this. There was across the road from the railway station on the CBD side, a little police outpost. And Brad will remember this, and other people will too, I suppose. It was open, I think, a couple of days a week. It was in a position where there can be people feeling unsafe, even if there are other people around, because of certain people who are around, perhaps. And I've sort of experienced that a little bit, or noticed other people not feeling too good about being around there. Now that's right there in the, across the road, not the tape side, the other side. And there was a little police outpost there for a while. I thought it might have been a good thing and gave a direct contact, but it was taken away, and I'm not sure why. So
I can tell you all about that.
yeah,
All right, so it's called. Yeah, it was called the Safer City Centre or something, I think.
Yeah.
And the council, they rented that shop after discussions with the police. The police wanted a place to base, some officers, and that's why it was there. Eventually, the police stopped using it. It was used as a little depot for parking inspectors and a place to pay your rates bill. And after about 2 years of that, where the police weren't interested in staffing it anymore, that's when the council pulled the plug.
So the police actually sort of pulled out.
Yeah, they just stopped using it. Yeah, they just weren't interested in staffing it anymore, or unable to staff it, or for whatever reason. And there was just a man behind the counter, as a place to go to pay your rates, and there was a locker room out the back for the parking inspectors. That was it.
I mean, I remember many years ago in my youth. I still like to think I'm young, but in my youth, I was involved in the local council, which has since become Nillumbik, ran a police, youth, and council committee. And I do recall being on that and actually having really proactive engagement between the local police, young people in the municipality and the council itself. And I don't get the same sense of that happening now. There does seem to be a bit of disengagement there. And one of the things that I know Gerard will talk to us about next week on Tuesday, when we talk about youth policy, is that one of the key issues for young people in Frankston City is that sense of safety and perception of sort of risk around that. I'm conscious of time. I'm going to throw to Justin, then Sue, I think, for your final reflections, and then we'll do a quick wrap up, and we'll let people get on with their sunny day.
And I do need to hang up. I apologise, guys, but again, appreciate the opportunity. Nice speaking with you all again. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Brad, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Thanks, Brad. Yeah.
Well, he's left at a time where I was actually going to give him a heap of kudos, because I think Brad covered it off really well. But now he's not here, I can say nice things about him.
Well, it'll swell his head, Justin. Have you seen?
Well, hopefully he's not going to watch this later anyway. But no, I think Brad made a really valid point in terms of. Sorry, I'll make notes as I talk. It made a very valid point about sort of encouraging the bustle. That sort of takes away a lot of the emptiness and the safety feelings around it. I don't necessarily support having a CCTV city. I think CCTV serves a purpose. It definitely serves as an opportunity for the city and for Vic Pol to use in certain circumstances. But I think it's more so put there as a deterrent as opposed to a solution. I think, as a council, we could definitely work a lot closer with Vic Pol. And interesting enough, you brought it up, Steve, about the police liaison officers. When I was involved with the Glenorchy Youth Task Force, there was a permanent presence from a youth liaison, a police liaison officer. Yeah, that was assigned to we'll call it a committee, our committee, and anything that involved sort of the Tasmanian police at that time. And I think that's an absolute opportunity for Vic Pol to get involved with not only the youth side of things, but sort of crime prevention, how we can address hooning, because that is something that affects Sue and I's ward. Overall safety, and I've already said the sort of community liaison. So, back, and I'm not going to say many years ago when I was a young person, just a little while ago, a little while ago, there used to be sort of police liaison officers in schools.
Yes,
And I'd be
I
interested
remember
to
that
know
as well.
whether or not it's sort of a financial decision or if it was a staffing decision. Because I know at one point in the not so long ago there was an issue with not having enough police. Whether or not that was sort of a mitigating factor behind sort of withdrawing those sort of initiatives. But I think it'd be important from a council perspective that we sort of foster those relationships, encourage them, and definitely see Vic Pole and a relationship between them as a significant resource to address a lot of these issues. And it's not saying, well, something bad's happened, we need to get on top of it. It's about what's the word I'm looking for? Doing it before it happens.
Yeah, a relationship, I think, a good relationship with the police, the community, the council. It's a positive thing. It's a positive thing. Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. Yeah.
Right, Sue, I might throw to you for a final remark.
Thank you. I've been mitigating the risk of barking and being shouted down, and this is the final way I can do that by her joining the conversation. Look, today has been really fascinating for me to just hear everybody's perspectives and come up with lots of different ideas. For me, it is all about listening to the community and all the community organisations on what their issues are. I have been approached by somebody who sent me pictures of those sort of road humps to calm the street. I'd love to know more about how, as a council, people go about determining whether that's needed or not, and whose agenda is it or not. So I think there are some sort of small issues and some bigger issues to get our heads around, or for the new council to get their heads around. So I think it's a fascinating area, and at the end of the day, it's all about keeping people safe, reassured, and when you feel that way, you enjoy your community and just being out and about in it. And I love to get out and about. A light street, wide open paths, maybe a few people around. I'm happy to walk almost anywhere. So so those are my thoughts on today.
Brilliant, thank you very much, Sue. And I guess my closing reflection is that if you'd asked me 20 years ago if Frankston was a safe place, I probably would have said no. But having lived here for the last 5 and a bit years, it absolutely is. And I have to say, being able to walk around, it's such a walkable city. I've never felt unsafe in Frankston, and even when talking to some of our local sort of vulnerable homeless people as well, I've never felt threatened by any of them. They're just people who are generally down on their luck, and we should be able to do more as a council for them. We are in October now, so get out there, clean your gutters, clear up your property, get ready for summer. It's going to be a wet summer probably, but that just means more growth. Doesn't mean we're not going to get hot days as well. Find out what you can do within your own community, because together we can make Frankston far more resilient, whether you're a business owner or just a resident or somebody who works here. There's something each of us can do, both at home and in our community. So thank you very much, Frankston. Stay safe. Go and get COVID tested if you've got any symptoms, because we do have a small cluster of cases in Frankston. But thanks very much. And we're back on Sunday at 4 o'clock for our Sunday sessions. We'll do a bit of a broad reflection across the week. And then next Tuesday, we are back with a special guest, Gerard Philippe, where we'll be talking youth policy. Thank you very much and goodbye.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Nice to see you. Thanks, everyone, for watching.
See you.